Let me tell you about a Tuesday in October, 4 years ago. I'm standing in a sales office in Naples, Florida, and I'm holding a pen over a contract for a 2-bedroom condo on the 14th floor of a building called the Ronsard. Gulf View. Private elevator bank. $140,000 HOA special assessment already approved for hurricane-proofing the facade, on top of the regular monthly fee of $1,800. The saleswoman is talking about the resort-style pool deck, and I'm nodding, and I'm thinking about the fact that I could write this check without checking a single balance. $14 million from selling a chain of dental practices I built over 31 years, invested conservatively, sitting there quietly compounding. I could buy that condo 11 times over and never feel it. And I remember looking at that pen in my hand and thinking, so why does signing this feel like putting on a coat that isn't mine? Now let me tell you where I am today. Right now, this actual Tuesday, 4 years later. I'm sitting on a wooden bench outside a house I own on a quiet stretch of coastline in the town of Anda, on the island of Bohol in the Philippines. It's just past 6 in the morning. The tide is far out, the way it goes twice a day here, and there's a woman named Nana walking the flats with a bucket, picking something out of the sand the way her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her. My coffee is local, grown 2 provinces over, and it cost me about 40 pesos, less than $1. There is no HOA, there is no assessment. There is a rooster somewhere behind my house that I have made a kind of uneasy peace with. And my net worth, for what it's worth, is actually higher today than it was the day I stood in that Naples sales office, because it turns out not buying the condo was the best financial decision I ever made, though that was never really the point. My name is Diane Ashworth. I'm 67 years old. I spent 3 decades building and running a group of dental practices across Ohio and Indiana, starting with one office I bought at 31 with a loan I was terrified I'd never pay off, and ending with 14 locations and a staff of over 200 people before I sold the whole operation to a private equity group 6 years ago. I was married once, for 11 years, to a man named Robert who died of a heart attack at 58, and I never remarried, not out of any grand statement, just because the right reason never showed up. I have one daughter, Caroline, who lives in Chicago and has 2 boys of her own, and a net worth that most people would consider more money than one woman could reasonably need. I want to say that plainly and get it out of the way, because I know exactly what some of you are thinking when you hear a woman with money talk about moving somewhere cheap. This was never about the money, but I understand why that's hard to believe, so let me walk you through how I actually got here. After I sold the practices, I did what a lot of people in my position do. I started looking at where wealthy retired women were supposed to end up. Naples, Sarasota, Palm Beach, if I wanted to go bigger than I actually wanted to go. I toured a dozen properties over about 8 months. Gated communities with names like the Estuary and Gray Oaks, guard shacks at the entrance, landscaping crews that showed up at 7 in the morning, driving crews of men who couldn't afford to live within 20 miles of the lawns they were mowing. I went to a few dinner parties in those communities. Everyone was pleasant. Everyone asked what my late husband had done for a living before they asked what I did, and I'd correct them, gently, every time, and watch the recalibration happen behind their eyes. The conversation circled the same handful of topics. Property values. Which country club had the better back nine? Which hurricane season was going to be the bad one? I kept waiting to feel like I'd arrived somewhere. I never did. I felt like I was auditioning for a role I didn't actually want, in a play about what a successful woman's retirement was supposed to look like. The insurance was the thing that finally cracked it open, if I'm honest. My homeowner's insurance quote on a modest single-family home near Sarasota came back at $31,000 a year, and that was before the agent told me, almost apologetically, that the number would likely climb every single year I owned the house. $31,000 a year to insure a house I hadn't even bought yet, in a state where entire neighborhoods were becoming uninsurable, where friends of friends were getting non-renewal letters after decades with the same company. I sat in my rental condo that night with a glass of wine and a legal pad, the same way I used to run numbers on whether to open a 5th practice or a 6th, and I wrote down a single question at the top of the page. What am I actually trying to buy here? Not the square footage, not the view, the feeling underneath it. And I couldn't answer it, which scared me more than any dental practice negotiation ever had. The trip to the Philippines happened almost by accident. My college roommate, a woman named Patricia, who I've known since we were both 19 years old, sharing a dorm room in Bowling Green, had a nephew doing marine biology fieldwork on Bohol, studying the reef systems, and she'd gone to visit him and came back talking about a beach town called Anda, the way people talk about a secret they're not sure they should share. Quiet, she kept saying. Not the touristy islands, the quiet one. She sent me photographs, white sand, water so clear you could see your own feet in 6 feet of it, and almost nobody on the beach. I booked a flight 2 weeks later, told myself it was just a trip. The way you tell yourself a lot of things right before your life changes. The flight itself was long, 17 hours from Cincinnati with a layover in Tokyo, then a puddle jumper down to Tagbilaran, then a 2-hour van ride across the island on roads that narrowed and narrowed until they were barely wider than the van itself, past rice paddies and roadside stands selling something called calamay wrapped in banana leaf, past churches that looked centuries old, which many of them are. By the time I reached Anda, I had been traveling for almost 24 hours, and I remember thinking, somewhere around hour 20, sitting in that van watching water buffalo stand in a flooded field, that this was either going to be a very expensive mistake or the beginning of something, and I genuinely couldn't tell which. The heat when I stepped out of the van hit me the way it hits everyone who's never felt it, thick and wet and immediate, and within minutes my linen shirt was stuck to my back. My hotel, a small place with 8 rooms run by a family, had no air conditioning in the common areas, just ceiling fans turning slowly, and I remember standing in the open-air lobby thinking about the marble entryway of the Ronsard, the cold hush of its air conditioning, and feeling a small, uncomfortable flicker of doubt about whether I'd made a foolish decision flying 17 hours to sweat in a place with spotty internet and roosters. That first evening, I walked down to the water alone. The beach really was empty. Just a few fishing bancas pulled up on the sand, and a couple of kids chasing a dog. I sat on the sand in my travel clothes, not caring anymore, and watched the sun go down. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was smaller. Not diminished, just appropriately sized. In Naples, I had felt like a number on a spreadsheet everyone was trying to solve for. Here, sitting on an empty beach with sand in my expensive shoes, I just felt like a woman watching a sunset, and it had been a very long time since I'd felt that ordinary and that content at the same moment. The doubt came back the next few days, the way it always does. It rained for 2 days straight, hard tropical rain that turned the dirt road outside my hotel into a reddish river, and the internet went out entirely on the second day, and I sat in my room unable to check email, unable to reach Caroline, feeling genuinely cut off from my own life for the first time in years, and I thought seriously about cutting the trip short. I had the resources to simply leave. I could have called the airline and been on a flight home within 48 hours, first class, and gone back to touring condos in Naples and never thought about this place again. I want to be honest that I came very close to doing exactly that. What changed things was small, the way these things usually are. On the third day, once the rain broke, I walked into the town proper, looking for a pharmacy, because I'd developed a headache that wouldn't quit, and I'd left my usual medication at home. I didn't know a word of Cebuano, and the pharmacy, a tiny place with a hand-painted sign, had a young woman behind the counter who spoke careful, textbook English. I explained what I needed as best I could, and she frowned slightly and said the specific brand I wanted wasn't something they carried, but there was an equivalent, and she wanted to make sure I understood the dosage difference before she sold it to me. She spent 10 minutes with me, unhurried, drawing little diagrams on a scrap of paper to show me the timing, refusing to just make the sale and move on to the next customer, even though there was a small line forming behind me. When I went to pay, it came to less than $2. I remember standing there holding my change, thinking about how many times over the years I had paid professionals a great deal of money and received a fraction of that woman's care and attention. Her name was Marites, and I found out later she ran that pharmacy with her mother and had turned down a job offer in Manila that would have paid triple what she made in Anda because her grandmother was getting older and needed her nearby. I didn't know any of that yet, standing at the counter. I just knew that something in me had unclenched a little, the way a hand unclenches after you finally realize you don't need to hold on to something so tightly. I extended the trip. Then I extended it again. By the time I flew home, 6 weeks after I'd arrived for what was supposed to be a 10-day visit, I had already had 2 conversations with a local lawyer about how a foreigner actually acquires property in the Philippines, because I'd learned enough to know it wasn't as simple as writing a check. Foreigners can't own land outright here, which surprises a lot of Americans. What you can do is own the structure on the land while leasing the land itself on a long-term basis, typically renewable, or purchase through a properly structured corporation with majority Filipino ownership, which is how a fair number of resident foreigners handle it. I chose the long-term lease route on a parcel about 400 meters from that same beach where I'd watched my first sunset, and I want to say clearly that I hired a Manila-based property attorney, not the friendly agent who first showed me the lot, and I'd tell anyone considering something similar to do the same. I've heard too many stories of Americans who skipped that step and lost money to informal arrangements that fell apart. Here is where I should probably talk about the money, because I know some of you are waiting for the numbers, and I don't think it's honest to skip them just because I don't need to save the way some people watching this do. My house here, a 3-bedroom with a wraparound porch and a garden Nana helps me tend twice a week, cost me just under $200,000 to build, land lease and construction combined, using a local builder who'd done work for 2 other expat families I'd met by then. Compare that to the $2.4 million. The Ronsard was asking for a condo with an $1,800 monthly fee and an insurance bill that would have run over $30,000 a year before the next rate hike. My total monthly cost of living here, including a woman named Faylee, who cooks and cleans 3 days a week for a fare, and, by local standards, generous wage, comes to under $1,500. I spend more than that some months simply because I choose to, because I fly Caroline and the boys out twice a year and I don't pinch on that, and because I've become something of a patron for a handful of causes in town, a scholarship fund at the local high school being the one I care about most. But the baseline cost of this entire life, in a house I love, on a beach most tourists have never heard of, is a fraction of what 1 year of Naples insurance alone would have cost me. I want to be honest about the parts that aren't easy, because I've watched enough of these videos myself to know when someone's only telling the pretty half. Healthcare is the real one. Anda itself has a small rural health unit, adequate for routine things, but for anything serious, you're looking at a drive to Tagbilaran, or in a true emergency, a medical evacuation to Cebu City, which is why I carry an international medical insurance policy that costs me about $4,000 a year, and which I consider non-negotiable at my age. I've used it twice, once for a kidney stone that turned out to be more urgent than I initially treated it as, and I'll say plainly that being far from a major hospital when you're 67 is a real risk, not a small one, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you something. The bureaucracy around my visa, a special resident retiree's visa, through the Philippine Retirement Authority, required a fair amount of paperwork and a required deposit that I had the resources to make without strain, which I recognize is not everyone's situation. The internet still goes out in bad weather. The nearest place to buy the specific brand of moisturizer I've used for 20 years is a 3-hour drive, and I have simply switched brands, which sounds trivial until you're the one standing in a drugstore in Tagbilaran, realizing how many small American habits you're going to have to let go of one at a time. And I miss my family in a way that doesn't have a workaround. Caroline visits twice a year, and we video call every Sunday, And my grandsons are getting old enough now to think their grandmother living on a beach in the Philippines is genuinely the coolest thing about her, which helps. But I wasn't there when the younger one broke his arm falling off a skateboard last spring. And I felt that distance in my whole body, sitting on my porch getting the news 6 hours after it happened, unable to do anything but listen to Caroline's voice and trust that she had it handled, which she did, because she is a capable woman. But a mother wants to be in the room anyway. That ache is real, and it hasn't gone away, and I don't think it's supposed to. What I didn't expect when I started building a life here is how much of my old life was actually just performance, and how little I noticed that until I stopped doing it. I don't dress for anyone here. I don't sit through dinners calculating what someone's really asking me when they ask what my late husband did. Nana and I have a running, half-gestural conversation about tides and weather that doesn't require either of us to know much of the other's language, and it is more genuinely companionable than most of the small talk I made over 11 years of country club dinners in Ohio. Marites, from the pharmacy, has become a real friend, someone I have dinner with every couple of weeks, and she has never once asked me what my house in the States was worth, because it has simply never occurred to her to care. There's a man named Tatay Ondoy, an old fisherman who's lived on this stretch of coast his entire 74 years, who took me out on his banca about a year after I moved here, and we didn't talk much because his English is limited and my Cebuano is worse. But he showed me a spot where he said the water was calmest at a certain hour, and we sat out there past sunset, not catching much of anything. And when we came back in, he refused to let me pay him for the trip, waved off the money the way people here so often do, and said something Marites translated for me later, roughly that the sea belonged to everyone who respected it, and he wasn't going to charge a neighbor to sit on it with him. I have never once, in 31 years of running a successful business, had an experience quite like that, a genuinely valuable thing offered to me with no transaction attached at all. I think about that Naples sales office sometimes, the pen in my hand, the woman describing the pool deck. I think about how close I came to signing, how easy it would have been to simply do what a woman in my financial position was supposed to do. Buy the view, join the club, spend my remaining decades being pleasant at dinner parties about hurricane insurance. I don't regret the money I made or the life I built to earn it, but I regret, just slightly, the years I spent assuming that the size of the check I could write determined the shape of the life I was allowed to want. People ask me sometimes, other women mostly, other women who've done well for themselves and are staring down the same choice I was staring down 4 years ago, whether it's really worth giving up the comfort and the familiarity and the 5-star everything for a beach town most people can't find on a map. And I tell them the honest answer, which is that I didn't give up comfort. I just found out comfort had never actually been the thing I was buying in Naples. What I was buying there was reassurance, a stamp of approval from a life I'd already outgrown. And what I have here instead is something quieter and much harder to put a price on, which is the simple daily experience of feeling entirely, unperformatively like myself. The tide's coming back in now. It does that twice a day here, reliable as anything I've ever known. And Nana's finishing up on the flats, and in a little while Feli will come by to start on the garden, and later this evening Marites is coming for dinner, and we'll sit on the porch and talk in our patchwork of 2 languages about nothing much at all. I have $14 million sitting quietly in accounts I rarely think about anymore, and I have this porch and this tide and a rooster I've made peace with, and a life that belongs entirely to me, instead of to anyone's idea of what a woman like me was supposed to want. If you'd shown that woman standing in the Naples sales office a photograph of where she'd actually end up happy, she wouldn't have believed you. I'm glad now that I never signed that pen.